Grey Owls Book 1 and Campaign 1, our first PC death, and it was like a permadeath. It was a moment where we couldn't retrieve the body. We couldn't. They were taken by an enemy and like just killed right there. Boom, boom, and taken. And it was a very distinct shift in the tone so far. But the way I connected with that player, I got the impression from them that they were okay, and then it became very apparent they were not okay with that. And the way it happened was very sudden. We couldn't go back. It was a very distinct break of what was done, and it took a lot of time to kind of rebuild some of that rapport in creating a new character and trying to find something that would work better or work in a more satisfying way, feel more connected to the world. It was a very difficult line, and I still don't think it was handled well. I don't think it worked well. So it just means, okay, that's a terrible rep, and now we need to move forward and endeavor to make that a better relationship.
Yeah. As like a quick response to that, this is something my father would say. Sometimes, we've said before, and I've said, like, you take a rep. The other way you can think of it is paying tuition. I agree. I watched that interaction happen, Adam. You just paid a steep tuition, and now you're in a little bit of debt. But now you're paying it off. That's the other way to think about it. Is when you mess up something like that. And also, I don't think you messed up that bad, right? But there was still that, kind of thing that happened with the dynamic. You paid tuition, right? And it's like, oof, I messed up. Every time you take the responsibility of trying to like remedy that, you're now paying off your debt. That's another way to think of mistakes like that. And also, it doesn't mean that, things aren't going to happen. But my question was, like, how would it have looked different if when that character got to 0 hit points and killed outright, you said, all right, your character mechanically has died. What happens next? And you said it that way. Now, I'm just curious. I'm not necessarily saying you should do this. I'm just wondering how that would have played out. If they had said, my character's neck gets snapped and the body gets taken away, that would be a very different thing than them saying, well, now I'm magically resurrected, which would also be a different thing to, these are my character's last words. Now DM, you take control, which is also different than, my character's body gets left behind so that they could be resurrected, So it's one of those things where now when you give that player that kind of narrative control, it's also a test of trust. You as a player, as the DM, I'm going to trust you to best serve the narrative for everyone. How are you gonna best serve everyone with your character's untimely demise, So it's more of a thought experiment, really, or a philosophical question than it is functional advice. I'm not saying DMs you should always do this. Especially, again, because if we look at our REST model, respect, empathy, satisfaction, trust, and rest, then then this is the end of the cycle. This is the test to see if ever you've done the first 3 enough. What's your investment going to look like on the other end of it,
There's an interesting point here when it comes to not just the variables of the game. So there's the randomness of a character death. There is the story of a possible character death, like threats have come bearing down on you, and maybe your great rival comes and there's a clash and it doesn't end in your favor, and what do we do about that? And then there's the interesting train of logic and progression of a character making leaps of logic or difficult decisions, let's put it that way, the dumb decision model of I go off on my own, I sneak into the guard base, and then I stab a guard. Is that something there? I mean, there are consequences to those actions. We want to make sure there's a logical through line to those consequences. And if they get arrested or get shot with crossbow bolts and die in the guard station because they infiltrated a guard base that they weren't even trying to infiltrate, they went off on their own and did that thing, that would probably garner, I think, at this point, I think at the beginning of our DMings and even my DMings, I feel like this has happened, that someone has like gone off on their own and done something really dumb, and I have had them get knocked out, not killed them, but knocked them out, and then have them be like publicly put on like the stocks or something, and then the other party can go, "What did you do?" But I have then heard so many stories of people going off on their own, and their character just died because they made a dumb decision. But then what was it about that thought train from the player that made them go do that? What were they thinking? And I'm not asking it like, what were you thinking? I'm asking, no, what were you thinking? What was the train of logic here that probably made you think this was going to be okay? Or what was the desire that you wanted to do this with? There's a miscommunication from the expectations of the table and what the player thought was appropriate.
Like, as a DM, the only thing I would say that you could do is, like, because we're talking about, like, this was a major enemy and this player decided to go solo them, right? You as the DM, again, this is stepping out of character to make sure your players understand. You could die, bro. If you had said that, by the way, for story reasons, I get that your character would do this. I get everything going on narratively to let you know this might end up with you dead. If you start with that, now you're setting an expectation. And it's like, do you really want to do that? And almost the conversation we're talking about having after a player dies, you almost set it up before they make the decision, you know? And yes, it's kind of metagamey, and is not metagaming worth harming a real friendship, you know? Jeremy Crawford says no. I've seen the tweets where if some kind of mechanical ruling or the authenticity of the story is going to harm a real world relationship or dynamic, then it is not worth it. Because the point of the game is to have fun. So if the fun is going to be impeded for some kind of integrity, like narrative integrity, then to me that tuition is too high.
I just wanted to mention before we get too far away from it that we were talking about Call of Cthulhu and how there are a lot of players out there who play Call of Cthulhu and they just play silly characters. And we were saying that's because they're not immersed. They haven't bought in to the setting. They haven't bought into their character possibly dying, and they don't want to. They don't think it's worth setting up the character for 3 to 6 to 9 hours, like me, in advance of the game, just to have them die. And another way to look at that psychologically is that silliness is a reaction to protect ourselves against emotional trauma. This is something that is like, it's a bit Psycho 101. It's not anything, super complicated, but it's something that we've heard a lot in some of our favorite anime, in some of the dubbed versions of our favorite anime, the abridged versions, like Hellsing Ultimate Abridged. Alucard is a very tragic character, but he's ridiculous. And the reason he's ridiculous is because he's so tragic. And then it's the same thing with Kirito in Sword Art Online Abridged. He's very silly and he has a lot of boundaries to people because he's been hurt or he's afraid to get hurt. And the arc is exploring what happens when he gets hurt. So in Call of Cthulhu, I think that's a good thing to do, is that you preface the game with your character might die. This is linked to that whole expectations thing. You say it at the start, it's possible for your character to experience a sudden death. What do you guys think of that? Like, how do we want to play this? Do you want that possibility on the table where the dice just roll wrong and your character is stripped away from you? That hope is gone. It is extinguished. Are you here for that? Or do we want to make it a little bit, take it a little bit more gently? Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon. And please, game responsibly.